I'm Francis Durnley, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, further to our usual updates on the ongoing crisis, we talk to Oleksandr Shyn, a Ukrainian activist who'll be telling us about his work on bridging the gap between Ukraine and Taiwan.
This hideous and barbaric venture of Vladimir Putin must end in failure.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon, we sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Tuesday, 12th of July, day 139. And today I'm joined by Joe Barnes, our Brussels correspondent, and Nicola Smith, our Asia correspondent, who has just returned from Ukraine and is based currently in Taiwan. I started by asking Joe on the latest developments of the past 24 hours.
Hi, Francis, and hi, folks. We have been in for quite 24 hours recently, despite there being this kind of operational pause that kind of Russia talks about. So I think the big headline story of the day is the death toll of the Russian missile strike that blew up an apartment block in the Donetsk town of, and excuse my pronunciation here, Chavez Yar, has climbed to 31 now. And so rescuers are still working on the scene, trying to pull more bodies out, trying to find more survivors. There is speculation that number is continuing to rise, the number of dead. So one Ukrainian MP has said on Twitter that it's at least 33 dead since Zelensky gave his overnight kind of address, spending out there being 31. And then on the flip side of that, we've had the Ukrainian strike on a Russian munitions depot deep behind the Russian line in the occupied town of Nova Kakhovka. Sorry, pronunciation again. Which Kremlin-backed media have said has killed at least 7 people and wounded 60 more. And I think we're going to go on to kind of the weapon systems behind that a little later. And then the other kind of things to note around are that Britain's Ministry of Defence, and this kind of goes in with what analysts have been saying recently, is they're outlining the struggle that Russia is having at replacing and kind of replenishing its forces that are kind of very battle-stricken. They've lost huge kind of numbers of troops. And so one thing the MOD has been saying today in its kind of daily intelligence briefing is that it's using non-traditional recruitment methods. And they're suggesting that they are literally pulling people out of prison and giving them to the Wagner group of kind of Kremlin-friendly mercenaries and basically sending them to fight. And so one thing that the MOD said, if this is true, this move likely indicates difficulties in replacing the significant number of Russian casualties that basically Moscow has sustained in the 138 days of war now. And so we've got more kind of signs that Russia is preparing to mount an attack on the Donetsk region. So it's mainly got control of Luhansk. So the kind of local officials there say that their forces are still kind of fighting kind of tooth and nail for little villages on the outskirts of the town, but Russia is creeping towards Donetsk, which is the other half of the Donbass region. And there's kind of likelihood that those attacks are going to be focused on Bakhmut, which is a town on the edge. And there's a road from Severodonetsk in Luhansk right through into kind of the main towns of the Donetsk region, and so Kramatorsk and Sloviansk are the two main ones we're looking at there. Then, so looking at some more domestic Ukrainian stories, Ukrainian's richest man, Rinit Akhmatov, has announced that he will hand over his entire media empire to the government, and that will be kind of great news in Brussels and in the West of kind of who are looking to Ukraine to kind of make sure that it gets rid of its oligarch culture, which Russia was unable to get rid of, and has basically kind of led to this moment because they're kind of looking to free Ukraine of corruption before they're kind of ploughing in vast sums of money to help with the rebuild and kind of take Ukraine into the European Union in the decades to come. And then other things I think we're going to touch upon in more detail later is the wheat field fires. So we've seen kind of footage being spread over social media and in local news reports of kind of the big blazes covering huge hectares of wheat, barley, and other grain fields in the Kherson region, which is in the south. And it's basically what Ukraine says is another part of its war, Russia's war on food exports. We know about the blockades of Ukraine's main ports, which means there's millions and millions of tons of grains kind of left to rot in various ports on the southern tip of Ukraine. But this is just another part of what Kiev says is kind of Russia's attempt to really harm Ukraine's main kind of export market. I think that's where we are so far.
Thanks, Joe. Just on that last point, I mean, some of the images that are coming out of these fields being burnt in Ukraine are really striking and concerning. You're based in Brussels. What is the feeling within the European Union at seeing images like this? Because we've talked, as you allude to there, a lot on this podcast about energy and food being on the front line in this war in a similar vein as to the military. So do you get a sense of the concern about this and the impact that this may have on Europe food supplies generally?
Oh no, so it's one of the massive things of kind of, and maybe even wider than the EU. So NATO circles, G7, G20, kind of just bilateral international diplomacy. A lot of it focuses on food. It might not affect Europe. It might not affect the UK, but Ukraine being kind of the global breadbasket, it mainly supplies kind of Africa in terms of it. And while the food crisis isn't imminent, it is coming. And the longer this war goes on, the higher the cost of breads and other kind of food staples in Africa will go up. And that will only drive kind of a global food crisis and kind of shortages of food that we've kind of seen recently in the past, but we've not really had it massively affecting kind of African countries that already kind of struggle with things like drought and being able to grow their own food. So that's one thing. Kind of Brussels, other kind of European capitals, I'm sure in Washington, in NATO allies, will be looking at closely is what Russia is doing, and the West has openly accused Russia of kind of waging a hybrid war in terms of blocking food exports and trying to basically crush one of Ukraine's main export markets being kind of grains. So they're watching this carefully, and they'll see this, and it will cause kind of anger, but it will also hopefully sharpen minds and kind of look at better plans for getting grains out of Ukraine quicker, because they've seen grain fields completely destroyed by shelling, and now we're seeing these kind of fields set on fire deliberately. That's what the Ukrainian police are saying. In deliberate arson attacks to basically crush their industry. So yeah, the West will take this kind of, especially not with kind of open arms. They will really be looking into it and looking what they can do to help out.
And just on that, we're hearing, this has only just been released in the last sort of half an hour or so, that there's continued and further financial support of Ukraine. And indeed, Ukraine's Prime Minister has thanked the United States for its support after receiving a further $1.7 billion in international financial assistance. And it also sounds as if there's been movement from Japan as well in agreeing to tackle the economic hit of the war on global markets. So further examples there of Western unity that won't necessarily attract the headlines. I mean, at the end of the day, it's just sort of more money, and that doesn't necessarily draw people to want to read the story, but really important developments nonetheless. Something else that's also just occurred in the last hour or so is that the Belarusian president has claimed that the West is preparing to attack Russia via the country. Not sure if you've got any thoughts on that, Joe. I mean, we've heard, of course, similar bombastic statements from the president of Belarus, but this seems quite a shocking one, and obviously intended for a domestic audience, but also no doubt appealing to Putin as well.
Yes, I would take what comes out of Lukashenko's government with a huge pinch of salt, as I would do Vladimir Putin's government. I think the West has been quite kind of stark in what it said, and it won't itself become involved in the war. It doesn't want to be provocative in any way in terms of using its own kind of its own troops, doesn't want its own boots on the ground. It doesn't want a military solution from its involvement and its point of view. It wants Ukraine to basically fight and win. And so I think that's kind of for the birds, that statement. I don't see the West suddenly deciding to march through Minsk onto Moscow, even though some people would probably be quite buoyed by what they've seen and the poor performance of the Russian army, and they would fancy their chances. I remember speaking to one former tank commander in the early days of the war, and he was saying that, blimey, a Challenger tank brigade would absolutely steamroll Russia in terms of what we've seen kind of so far. But that is very much not on the cards, and I think Lukashenko and his government are probably telling porcupines.
Yes, absolutely. And I would just add to that, as we've talked about many times in the podcast, there is a sort of mentality within Russia and within parts of Eastern Europe that really are sort of paranoid about the idea of Western invasions, which of course have taken part not only in the 20th century but also in the 19th century, and that mentality is often fed upon by the leaders of those countries in order to garner support for the operations like those that we've seen in Ukraine. Just whilst we're on the subject of military affairs, before we turn to Taiwan, I know you were keen, Joe, to talk about HIMARS and developments in that area of weaponry. Just wanted you to hear your thoughts on that before we turn to Nicola and Oleksandr.
Brilliant. Yeah, it's kind of one. It's a shame that Dom Nichols, our defence and security editor, is not here, because he would really be able to go into the nitty gritty on the details of these, what are really quite impressive weapons. But so we've seen basically a spell of strikes on Russian munitions dumps in the last few weeks, and that kind of correlates with the fact that these HIMARS, which are the US version, and then the UK kind of donated multi-launch rocket systems arriving on the battlefield and in the hands of the Ukrainian army. And so I think, given what we've seen, it is fair to suggest that the attack last night on the Russian munitions depot was carried out by one of these weapons. And there's absolutely stacks to say about them. The Ukrainians, now they're kind of arriving in their hands, are quite confident that they can be pivotal in turning the dial and helping them. And so for today's Telegraph Dispatches newsletter, our email newsletter, which you can sign up to, I've looked at their immediate impact on the battlefield and the terror they've created amongst pro-Kremlin figures. So we've got military bloggers and former commanders now actually openly criticising Russian tactics, suggesting they're not doing enough to camouflage or move munitions dumps, basically leaving them open to these long-range attacks. And these missiles can hit targets of 50 miles away with kind of pinpoint precision. Roland Oliphant, our senior foreign correspondent, did a great piece in today's paper online for everyone to read about how witnesses of these attacks said that they can literally strike a penny from 50 miles away. That is the kind of levels of precision that we're seeing, and that these GPS kind of guided missiles and rockets have. And so one of the things I would kind of suggest our listeners go on, Lockheed Martin, who supplied the HIMARS, they're the kind of the high mobility artillery rocket systems that the US are donating, have got these videos on their YouTube, and they show like kind of how they work. They literally only need 3 men to man them. They need a driver, kind of a gunner, and then like the rocket officer. And they don't need any extra support vehicles. They have an inbuilt crane that can pick up the battery of 6 missiles, load them up within 3 minutes, drive off, fire, and then be out of kind of range of any kind of Russian counterfire within minutes. They are kind of truly remarkable bits of kit. But I think that is one thing we're going to look at kind of as the summer goes on, and as kind of Russia is in this operational pause. Ukraine is going to be really looking at targeting their logistical hubs and basically making it harder for Russia to kind of replenish and launch offensives elsewhere. And so one of the complaints that military bloggers were making, that the operational pause actually leaves Russian kind of ground forces and their kind of logistics hub open to attack. They're basically saying that Russian forces, because they're paused, aren't doing enough work to hit the lines of communication. And that's basically the roads that Ukraine uses to move the MLRS and the HIMARS systems around. So that's one thing that's really kind of bugging the Kremlin, and it's kind of one of the first sorts of proper open dissent that we're seeing against the Kremlin's tactics since the war in Ukraine. So we've kind of had, we could speak about kind of soldiers' wives complaining about conscription, or like how they're being driven into the ground and are all exhausted. But actually, this is now tactics being questioned on the ground battlefield tactics that are being questioned. And the more and more of these systems that the West kind of donates, I know the US has donated about 9, the UK 2 or 3, and there's more kind of German promised ones on the way. Apparently, we've kind of hold our breath on that one. But the more of these kind of really high-tech systems that arrive in Ukrainian hands, and the more kind of Western training they receive, the more lethal they will be. So I was in a briefing with a Western official the other day, and they were basically saying, look, the more systems that these arrive, and as the Ukrainian forces gain greater capability, especially with the precision, lethality, and range, that will basically expand the amount of realistic targets that they've got to hit behind kind of enemy lines. And this will enable them to kind of soften up the Russian line to launch counteroffensive. So I think this is one thing that we should really look for across the summer, is the effectiveness of these weapons and how the Ukrainian kind of armed forces is developing to a kind of a NATO standard army, rather than one that uses kind of the old Soviet doctrine of basically spray and pray, fire as much kind of munitions as possible and hope for the best. I think now we've got these kind of one-off kind of very precision systems that we'll start to see a lot more kind of unique targets being taken out, and hopefully kind of softening the Russian lines up for offensives later on.
Well, thank you very much, Joe, for that and for the updates. Let's turn now to the main topic for today, which is Taiwan. Now, we've spoken a lot on this podcast about the potential ramifications for Taiwan of the war in Ukraine, as China, which lays claim to Taiwan, is as we know, looking at the conflict in Ukraine and how things are developing there, and how that might impact what they do in the short and the long term in relation to Taiwan. So to talk about this, we've got Nicola Smith, who, as I say, is our Asia correspondent, and also very lucky to have Oleksandr Shyn, who is based in Taiwan, to discuss this. Just turning to Oleksandr first, can you just introduce yourself and talk about the work that you do?
Thank you, Francis, and hi, everyone. I'm really glad to be here. Thank you so much. I would like first to clarify, to avoid future confusion, I am not Ukrainian-Taiwanese. I'm Ukrainian of Korean descent, but I lived in Taiwan since last year. And, since I came here, of course, as most Ukrainians has all had a different focus, I guess. But then it changed with this new invasion. Currently, I'm involved in several projects in support of Ukraine, several fundraising campaigns, and in the movement that we call Taiwan Stands with Ukraine, which is a nationwide, largest in Taiwan movement in support of Ukraine. So that's the things I've been doing here.
Thank you. And Nicola, just perhaps you can give us a bit of the lay of the land on some of the context around Taiwan and why the war in Ukraine is very relevant to this, and then we can talk to Oleksandr further.
So Taiwan and Ukraine, there are a lot of parallels between their situations, and Taiwan has long faced a threat from China, which the Chinese Communist Party claims Taiwan as its own territory, even though it has never ruled there. Taiwan is a democracy of some 23.5 million people, and it has its own government, its own currency, its own military. And for decades, it has faced the threat of invasion from China. And what I've seen on the ground, I've been here since 2016, and I've seen in the past few months since Russia's invasion of Ukraine that the public has become very, very much aware, much more aware of this threat that they're facing from China. There's a huge public consciousness now about what could happen if there was a worst case scenario. It's really focused people's minds about how they should react, how the government would react, how the public would react. And they've been watching Ukraine very, very closely. It's been a huge news story. The Taiwanese government has made several large donations to Ukraine in terms of humanitarian aid and medical supplies. There have been a lot of public or private groups who have also been making donations. And there's been a lot of empathy in the public for Ukraine's crisis and for the situation for people there. It's been a real wake-up call, really, for the Taiwanese public that they could face a worst-case scenario. And there's been a lot of debate about how they should respond. This has been in multiple ways. Firstly, they've been looking at how to create a credible enough deterrent to prevent China from invading. And that's in terms of weapons purchases, what weapons to buy. There's been a large focus on asymmetric warfare. This means to buy small portable weapons that could inflict maximum damage on invading forces. And this is a tactic that we have seen in Ukraine. So Taiwan's been following that closely. There's also been a lot more debate about the professional army and reservists and how best to organise that, and also about how to create a sense of resilience among the public, teaching people how to deal with an emergency, a medical emergency, when hospitals are not available. There have been an increase in courses teaching people how to do trauma training. There's been an increase in people's interest in going to gun ranges, even though guns are very strictly controlled. So a lot of the training is done on replica guns. And there's been a lot of debate on how to reform mandatory military service and how Taiwan can best prepare the whole of society to make the concept or the prospect of China invading extremely painful for Beijing and to change that political calculation. And these are issues that have long been in the political sphere in Taiwan. This is nothing new, but certainly in the past few months, the situation in Ukraine has really focused minds and really put all of these issues to the forefront of political debate.
Well, thank you, Nicola. Oleksandr, you're a coordinator of the Ukraine-Taiwan Forum. I'm sure our listeners will be very interested in the work that you do for that. How long has it been going? Has it been from before the war, or is it a recent development since February?
Well, we had the idea of this project for quite a long time now. But with this new invasion, I think it kind of gained a new meaning for us because, well, since we don't have an embassy or any representation in Taiwan, often things that Taiwan does for Ukraine go unnoticed, unfortunately. And as Nicola said, Taiwan is indeed doing a lot of things for Ukraine. So we really didn't want this to go unnoticed by our society, by our government, by the media. That's why we created Ukraine plus Taiwan Forum, to be able to discuss and amplify about what Taiwan is doing for us to the Ukrainian audience in Ukrainian language. So it's been going on for several months now, and I think it's going very well. We kind of managed to capture Ukrainian people's attention on the aid that Taiwan is providing, both, the official Taiwan and the regular people. And I think it kind of helped us to also gain the attention from the official Ukrainian government. And that, of course, helps us to, here being in Taiwan, to leverage more aid, to advocate for more support from the Taiwanese people, because now we can show them that Ukraine is indeed acknowledging that support.
Thank you. Just a question to both of you, possibly starting with Nicola. You've touched a bit on this already, but I'm just very interested in what is the feeling now in Taiwan? Is there a real sense that there could be an imminent danger from China in a very short period of time, within a matter of months? Or are we still thinking here much more sort of long term from that, depending on what takes place in Ukraine in the coming year or so?
There's always been a sense of danger in Taiwan. There's always been a sense that time is running out for China to take aggressive action against Taiwan. And that has been seen increasing in the past few years, especially since the Hong Kong protests and the crackdown on Hong Kong. Taiwan has had this sense of we could be next, and what do we do to prevent that? And that's a sense that has also been picked up in the international community as well. The US has for decades been Taiwan's biggest arms supplier, and in recent years they have increased their rhetoric and their requests to Taiwan to invest a lot more in asymmetric weapons. And we have seen that. We've seen increases in Taiwan's defense budget over the past year, and a much tighter focus on what weapons should be used to defend the islands from China, and not only to defend the island, but also to prevent an invasion in the first place. And when I was in Ukraine a few weeks ago, that was what officials were saying to me there, that they felt that Taiwan still had this chance to stop an invasion, and to prevent China from taking that action, to show to China that it would be a very painful calculation. And so this has always been one of Taiwan's top priorities, and this sense of China coming closer to taking aggressive action has been growing. Last year, the defense minister of Taiwan predicted that China would be capable of invading by 2025. That echoed a similar calculation from the head of Indo-PACOM in the US, Admiral Philip Davidson, who last year said that it could happen within 6 years. And so there really is always a sense that time is running out, that we have to do everything possible now to change President Xi's calculation. And the Ukraine war hasn't changed that timescale. I don't think people think that, or the government here thinks that invasion is imminent, but it has certainly raised the debate of how do we best take action now to prevent the worst case scenario.
Just before I go back to Oleksandr, why does China see Taiwan as a threat or as a target? Just for the benefit of our listeners who perhaps aren't aware of the geopolitical significance of Taiwan.
China doesn't see Taiwan as a threat, but it does. The Chinese Communist Party claims Taiwan as its own territory, even though the Chinese Communist Party has never ruled Taiwan and the People's Republic of China. Taiwan has never been part of the People's Republic of China. Taiwan has, if we go back, just in a kind of brief summary, if we go back to the 1911 revolution in China, both governments in Taipei and Beijing trace their origins to the 1911 revolution that ushered in a new Republic of China. But the Communist Party have never captured Taiwan in a subsequent civil war. So in the late 1940s, Chiang Kai-shek, who was the leader of the nationalist Kuomintang, who was fighting communist forces in the Chinese Civil War, he retreated to Taiwan with an estimated 1.2 million military personnel and civilians. And so he relocated the seat of the Republic of China to Taipei and imposed martial law. And this was lifted in 1987. And Taiwan is now a thriving democracy. It has a very strong sense of identity. And so the Kuomintang forces initially, it was their goal to retake mainland China. That goal has long been cast to the wind. But now President Xi Jinping sees it as his legacy to take over Taiwan, and claims that Taiwan has been a historical territory of China, which just isn't the case. There are also very strong political reasons for China to want to take over Taiwan. It has a Pacific coastline that would give China a great military advantage in the Pacific, especially at a time where it's an increasing competition with the US over influence in the Indo-Pacific. And Taiwan is also a world leader in semiconductors. It dominates the semiconductor industry. So there are many reasons why it would be advantageous for China to gain control over Taiwan. But it's, as I said, it's a thriving democracy. It functions like any other nation. And there's also a strong moral imperative not to allow China to just take over any territory that it wants, in the same way that it is for, to oppose Russia taking over whatever territory it wants to.
Well, thank you, Nicola. Oleksandr, I just wonder if you've got any thoughts on what Nicola was saying there. But also I had a question, which is, what is your message to Taiwanese people when you speak to them about Ukraine? How do you impress upon them the significance, or do you not need to? Is Ukraine so omnipresent over there that actually people are very, very aware of the importance of this and the potential ramifications for Taiwan?
Well, yeah, I agree with Nicola. I feel like the topic of Ukraine and the Russian invasion here is very widely discussed. And indeed, often we don't really need to, convince people of the importance of this. People would come on their own, offer their support and help. And that happens all the time, every day, basically. And well, in many of those conversations I have with Taiwanese people, I feel like they resonate with our situation on many levels. And of course, there's always this factor of China in the conversation. And people say that because of this new Russian invasion of Ukraine, many Taiwanese people sort of, as they say, changed the way they view their country, the way they view China, the way they view Taiwan-China relations. And maybe these analogies, well, they're flawed, because we here at least try not to say that Taiwan and Ukraine are similar in this regard. But I think this kind of sense helps people resonate more and makes them, support Ukraine more, donate and advocate for Ukraine. So that happens a lot.
Thank you. And just wondering what your own personal experience has been since the war began. Were you surprised? Do you have a lot of friends and family who are in Ukraine? Perhaps you were even there when the invasion began. Just interested in your personal experience of the last few months.
Mm-hmm. Well, these were the worst several months in my life. I won't sugarcoat that. I was in Taiwan since October last year. So when this invasion started, I was here in Taiwan already. And yeah, I do have friends and family in Ukraine. Most of my extended family, they are in southern Ukraine, in occupied southern regions. So as Joe mentioned earlier, the food crisis that is happening right now in Ukraine and globally, that's what people that I know, my relatives there, what they experience often is the abundance of food, and I know it would sound weird, but that's the way it works. A lot of food that is produced in these southern agrarian, super fertile regions of Ukraine is trapped, and Russians are basically terrorizing the farmers and breaking the usual trade routes. And now that the produce is not leaving the occupied areas, and you can see the prices rising in the, as we say, the free territories of Ukraine. And my friends would often tell me how they have to overpay for, basic stuff like vegetables there. While in occupied Kherson, for example, food is, produce is so cheap that farmers are actually struggling to make, their business as usual. Yeah, so that is happening. Generally, it's been emotionally devastating, of course, but I think the community is something that's really helpful for us Ukrainians overseas. I mean, then again, because we don't have an embassy here, we didn't really know other Ukrainian people. There was no like a centralized community before. But with this new invasion, we've all met each other, mostly, under the walls of the Russian representative office, where we protest all the time. And that's how we got to know each other. It really helps to know other people who have relatives, friends back home who are going through the same thing. And it really helps us not to, give up and keep moving. That's where the strength is.
Thank you. And just one last question for, I have another one for Nicola. How many are part of your forum? Is it a large community or is it a small community that do a lot? Just trying to get a sense of how many Ukrainians there are in Taiwan.
I think you're talking about not Ukraine plus Taiwan Forum, but Taiwan Stands with Ukraine. That's indeed a large movement. We have, most of us are Taiwanese and Ukrainians, but of course, key activists are also Lithuanians, Poles, Hong Kongese people. So basically people from all around the world who live in Taiwan and who are not indifferent in this time and who support Ukraine by volunteering their efforts, their resources all the time. It's quite a large movement. And then Ukraine plus Taiwan Forum is a platform that was created by Liberal Democratic League of Ukraine. It's a youth political organization back in Ukraine. And before the second invasion, this organization was advocating for Taiwan-Ukraine rapprochement. And we wanted closer ties with Taiwan. But now mostly, as I said, we focus on amplifying Taiwan in Ukraine, Taiwan's aid in Ukraine.
Thank you. Nicola, just turning back to you, what lessons do you think China and Taiwan are drawing from the Ukraine war, first of all? Because no doubt there's a lot of analysis that's taking place in both Kiev and in Beijing on this matter.
Absolutely, and we don't really know exactly what Beijing is learning from Taiwan, from Ukraine. But we can take an educated guess that they will be looking, first of all, at the battlefield tactics and how Russia is faring there. Russia was certainly was expected to take over Ukraine within a matter of days, and its army has been falling apart in many ways, and Ukraine has put up a really good fight, and even though China has invested so much in its navy and its military capabilities, its forces are largely untested, and that must be something that is on Xi Jinping's mind about how to avoid the same kind of humiliation that President Putin has faced. And then I'm sure they'll also be looking at how the international community has reacted. We've seen a huge response from the international community in terms of sanctions against Russia. And that's something that the heads of the FBI and MI5 flagged last week in a speech in London. They said that China was already trying to find ways to cushion itself from from potential sanctions if it takes action against Taiwan. And it will also be looking at how the private sector has got involved and how the private sector has reacted to the Russia-Ukraine war, because it has always relied on loyalty in a way from the private sector, where China is such a large market. And another issue that I'm sure it's looking at is the civil resistance that we've seen in Ukraine, where so many ordinary people have stepped up. There's been a huge number of volunteers joining the fight. There's been a huge response from the Ukrainian public, and they've been a big part of defeating Russia's advances in Kyiv, and also in putting up such a stiff resistance on the front lines. And that's certainly something that Taiwan will be looking at as well. this idea of civil resilience and civil resistance as well. And there is a parallel between Taiwan and Ukraine in terms of them both having much larger authoritarian neighbours, and being, on paper, they're both vastly outmatched by Russia or China. But Taiwan will be looking at how Ukraine has taken a smart, creative approach to really put up such a strong fight against Russia. And I'm sure that they'll be looking at how they've done that, both in terms of what weapons they've used and also how they have organised their civilian population. And they'll be looking at how Ukraine has managed to really dominate the narrative on what's been happening throughout this whole war. They've done an excellent job at communications and really putting their message out there. And that's something that I know that Taiwan is considering. How would they keep communications up and running, and how would they put their message out to the world? What's the most effective strategy of doing that? So I think those are really the main things that China and Taiwan will be looking at just now, and then there's also just the consideration of how the international community will also react. It's likely that the US would take a more interventionist approach if Taiwan was invaded. In 2020, Taiwan was America's 9th largest trading partner, while Ukraine was 67th. So Taiwan is also a very integral part of Washington's Indo-Pacific policy. It's strategically, it's part of the so-called First Island chain, and it's geographically very close to key trade routes in the South China Sea and Indo-Pacific. So these are all things that will come into consideration, both in China, Taiwan, and also in the United States and the wider international community.
Thank you, Nicola. That was very comprehensive and fascinating to hear your perspective on that. We're almost out of time, and I'll definitely give Oleksandr the final word. But before we do that, Joe, I'll give you the final thought, your final thought in a moment. But first of all, I just wanted to ask you something that we haven't covered on this podcast, which is the fact that you have been sanctioned by Russia as part of your work for The Telegraph. And just wanted to hear your experience of that. Did it come as a shock? Did you have forewarning of that? Do you know specifically what it was for? Just, I'm sure it will be of interest to our listeners to hear what it's like to be sanctioned.
So it's almost a month to the day since we discovered, and there was the 29 British journalists on there. So from The Telegraph, it was myself, James Rothwell, who's based in Jerusalem for us, Chris Evans, our editor, and Con Coughlin, who's our chief foreign affairs columnist and one of our defence editors. And no, we didn't get any forewarning. We just, I think Natalia, our kind of correspondent from Moscow, now living in Istanbul, emailed me and said, "Joe, you're on the sanctions list." And I was in a briefing at the time on talking about Brexit and my other life. And so I must admit, it came as a bit of a shock to me, because you don't often think that your work is kind of read by kind of people in Moscow or even in other European capitals. You don't kind of feel that picked up at times. So no, it was fascinating. Has it done anything to me? No, not really. I've not kind of got any ambitions to go to Russia. I did go down to the Kaliningrad border the other day, but I kind of thoughtfully decided not to try and cross over, of fear of being locked up in a gulag for our what was called fake news spreading on the Donbass. So no, I would rather consider it a badge of honour of the good work that we've been doing at the Telegraph to kind of unearth what's going on in Ukraine from afar, and obviously we've had the great people there and helping them tell the story. So I think the best thing we could say of it is kind of just keep ploughing on and keep kind of going through and trying to unmuddle the Russian mistruths and kind of tell our readers and what's actually happening on the ground and what's happening in kind of these rooms of European diplomacy, world diplomacy on sanctions.
Fascinating. And just one other question. Did you get contacted by the British government at all, or are you basically just sort of left to sort of take the hit, as it were, or do you get advice from the government about how you have to proceed based on, you know, being sanctioned by a major world power?
No help or assistance at all. I think when I told some of my colleagues that work here in the mission and the embassy to Brussels, they laughed and they were like, "Why can't I be on the list? Why haven't I done enough to be included on the list?" So I think at the moment they're probably all taking it with quite a pinch of salt and basically hoping that no one from Britain is kind of, especially in kind of the media eye, is foolish enough to go to Russia at the moment, because we are considered kind of public enemy number one there for our support and our backing for Ukraine in its kind of battle against the invasion. So no help, no assistance, but maybe a pat on the back. And I think someone bought me a pint to celebrate. So.
Well, no doubt we'll have a lot of invitations from our listeners to buy you another pint, Joe. Thank you for that. And what's your final thought for us today? What should we be thinking about as we enter the next week?
So we were speaking about kind of Western unity the other day, and I quite like this story that we covered in today's paper about how a turbine that was owned by Gazprom, the Russian energy giant, was in Canada for kind of being refurbished, scheduled maintenance, and Canada basically refused to send it back to Russia because of Western sanctions. And it said that flouted the sanctions. But now, over last weekend, Canada had a bit of a change of heart and said that we will release this turbine to Germany, and then Germany can then give it to Russia, give it to Gazprom to basically kind of restart restart pumping gas back through the Nord Stream 1 pipeline, which runs Russian gas from Russia under the Baltic Sea into Europe. And Zelensky, in his overnight speech, basically gave a big ticking off to the Canadians, saying, "Look, if you're making exceptions now against kind of this terrorist state, what's going to come in the future? You're just allowing yourself to become like a kind of a pawn in Putin's game, essentially." So I think actually now we're going to start looking at, as kind of cost of living squeezes, that we're kind of nearing the winter period and kind of preparations for winter. Are kind of these Western governments, especially in Europe, going to start looking at kind of maybe loosening or finding ways around their own sanctions on Russia to basically help people here kind of deal with energy shortages, maybe food shortages in the future, and stuff like that? That's one thing that I would kind of look for. It's maybe not an immediate kind of for the week, but well, the one thing we do have is in 10 days, Nord Stream 1 from yesterday is down for maintenance, so it won't be pumping any gas. So I think they've promised that it will be up and running after 10 days, but the German government has suggested actually Europe should brace itself, and which is mainly itself, for no gas supplies coming from Russia through the Nord Stream 1 pipeline after this 10 days maintenance, as part of kind of Putin's use of energy as leverage for loosening those sanctions. So I think that's what we should look forward to in the future days.
Thank you, Joe. And Nicola, what are your final thoughts for us?
Well, I think really we've often spoken of Ukraine, the war in Ukraine, in the wider sense of it being a battle of democracy versus authoritarianism, and Taiwan is very much part of that global debate as well. And I think that in the same way that Ukraine does not want to be forgotten by the international community, Taiwan does not want to be forgotten either. And I guess in the UK and in Europe, it seems like it's the other side of the world, that it's a very abstract issue. And it's really not. An invasion of Taiwan would impact everyone. As I mentioned, the FBI and MI5 directors said last week that it would have a catastrophic or very dramatic impact on the business community if there was an invasion of Taiwan. But also it would be a great humanitarian tragedy if that happened. And really, I think it's on the international community now to do everything that it can to prevent that from happening. And that doesn't just mean arms sales to Taiwan. It means standing up to China and to China's coercive diplomacy globally to prevent this awful scenario from ever happening.
Thanks very much for that, Nicola. And Oleksandr, would you like the final word to our listeners?
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. I would like to also commend Nicola for her courage, for her reporting from Ukraine, because, well, we all know there's unfortunately no safe place in our country at this moment, and there's always risks for reporters. And just pretty much everyone who reports on Ukraine, you have no idea what kind of important job you're doing, because, well, there's only this much time that people can actually pay attention to someone else's tragedy. And we can see that this attention is going down, and I'm sure we'll experience this here in Taiwan as well. So it's extremely important that we keep talking about this, because war is going on. Parts of our territories are still occupied and people are still dying. So it's very important that we keep talking about this. And just something that I wanted really to say is the amount of support that Ukraine is receiving now is, I think it's an indication for the Taiwanese people, because Taiwanese people can see, and it's about their hopes or disappointment on whether, if something happens, God forbid, Taiwanese people would be supported by others, would be helped, and would be talked about. So I think the more support we give to Ukraine now, the more hope we give to Taiwan that these 23 million people that are living on this island will not be left alone when they're fighting for their democracy, for their freedom, for this amazing social system that they've built for people. So that's something that I wanted to say. Thank you so much.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 30 days completely free at telegraph.co.uk/audio. Or sign up to Dispatches, our Ukraine newsletter, which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so you don't miss it. If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave a review, as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch with us directly by emailing podcasts@telegraph.co.uk. We do see and read every message. Ukraine the Latest is produced by Louisa Wells and Giles Gear, and today on Twitter, Jaden Irving.